Hello, everyone. This is World Review with Ivo Daalder, a weekly look at news from around the world produced by the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. It's Friday, September 20. What a week it's been. We start with the Middle East, where a war between Israel and Hezbollah now appears all but inevitable. Earlier this week, pagers and other wireless devices used by Hezbollah blew up simultaneously, killing nearly 40 people and wounding thousands of others. Overnight, Hezbollah launched a major rocket attack against northern Israel, and Tel Aviv responded with a strike in downtown Beirut. Meanwhile, the U.S. keeps on searching for an ever-elusive peace. Then the rise of the far right. On Sunday, another election in Germany that the Alternative for Democracy in Germany is either expected to win or do very well in. In France, a new government can survive only with the support of the far-right National Assembly. And in the United States, Trump represents the hope of many far-right leaders, not only in the U.S., but in Europe and beyond. And then finally, we take a look at Ukraine, where this week, President Zelensky will come to the United States to meet with President Biden and the two candidates vying to replace him. He will brief them on his plans for peace, which he hopes to pursue at a meeting later this year that should also be attended by Russia. What can we expect from this effort to end a war that has destroyed large parts of Ukraine and left hundreds of thousands, if not more, dead and wounded? Here to talk about these issues are three reporters who cover these stories. Stefanie Bolzen is North America editor for Die Welt. Stefan Kornelius is political editor for the Süddeutsche Zeitung. And Andrew Roth is the global affairs correspondent for The Guardian. Good morning, all. Good afternoon for Stefan, who's in Munich. Wonderful to see you. It's great to have Andrew and Stefanie on for the first time. Welcome. Andrew, let's start with you. The news, as we were just mentioning before we got on the air, is exploding literally every morning when it comes to the Middle East. So much happening there. No one is talking about Gaza. Everybody seems to be talking about the pending war between Israel and Hezbollah, which Israel announced earlier this week was impending. What can you tell us about where we are today, and what are the questions that are uppermost in your mind as you report on this story?
Yeah, it's really been a fairly breathtaking week of events in Lebanon so far. Beginning earlier this week with the attacks on thousands of pagers that were booby-trapped, likely by the Israelis, we believe. The second day of then moving on to the booby-trapped walkie-talkies. And then today we've had a strike that's taken out a top Hezbollah leader, Ibrahim Akil, who is the second in command of the group's military wing after another, military commander was killed earlier this year. The Israelis have really shown that they have the ability to strike, deep within Hezbollah, and that they've pretty much been able to exploit the group's weaknesses pretty convincingly. This is an extremely embarrassing week for Hezbollah, and despite leader Nasrallah's kind of statements that there was going to be a kind of massive counterattack and there was going to be retribution, he called these acts mass terrorism. It's not really clear at the moment exactly what capabilities Hezbollah is going to have in order to be able to fight back against what's going on this week. So the Israelis have shown that, at the very least, that they can embarrass Hezbollah and that they have extensive capabilities to do so. And I think the biggest question that everybody has at the moment is, what is the point of this? What's going to happen out of these operations and what's going to come next? From what I've heard, there are kind of 2 points of thought so far. One is that specifically this attack targeting the communications equipment was designed to be a prelude to a larger operation and escalation in Lebanon. So by attacking the communications equipment, first of all, they've taken out a lot of senior Hezbollah fighters along with rank and file, but they've also made it very difficult for the group to communicate amongst itself. They've literally weaponized the communications equipment that the group used, and it's made it very difficult for them to coordinate. But the second point of thought could be that this could be something that's being done in lieu of a larger military operation as well, kind of everything but. And there are people who are skeptical about the idea that Israel is going to go into Lebanon right now, full bore. But the messages and the words that we've heard coming out of Israel at the moment this week from Defense Minister Yoav Gallant and from others is that there is going to be some kind of an escalation, that attention in Israel is focusing north on Lebanon. So, I mean, with these explosions taking place every day, it does seem that the direction that this conflict is going is definitely to escalate and likely to turn into a larger operation run by the Israelis.
Andrew, I think that was exactly right, and poses the question of what are the Israelis trying to do? Stefanie, what's your guess? I mean, on the one hand, clearly you had the statement from the Israeli leadership that the people who have moved from the north, 100,000 or so people who had to be moved from the north after the Hezbollah started to attack northern Israel with rockets, need to come home. And they've clearly also dismissed the diplomatic strategy for that. But on the other hand, having a major war with Lebanon right now, with Hezbollah, which has some 150,000 rockets, is that really something that the Israelis can afford or are looking forward to? How do you look at it?
Well, I think it's the fact that it's escalating. So we're seeing more and more attacks and missiles targeting Lebanon. And I think there was just news this Friday morning about a targeted missile coming down in a suburb of Beirut. But one thing, of course, is also that reportedly these pages weren't meant to explode when they did. So there obviously has been a mistake by the Israelis, who now have to act on something they maybe, again, reportedly wanted to act on later. So it seems like it's a very, very tense and very fragile situation. And that makes one be worried, because it might escalate without, as you say, the Israelis really having a strategy and a plan, because they didn't mean to do what they are doing now, or at least not now.
Interesting. I hadn't realized there were reports that this might not have been planned, but that's a very interesting angle, and it does raise. I mean, Stefan, in some ways, it raises this larger question that Andrew also raised. You know, the technological prowess of Israel is established. I mean, they can reach deep into Tehran and kill the leader of Hamas. They can target leaders in Beirut. They can blow up pagers and walkie-talkies, and they can find people inside Gaza. But what is the political strategy behind it? Because, as Clausewitz said, war is the continuation of politics by other means. It kind of looks like this is just war without much of a politics in it. How do you look at it, and what question does that raise for you for the kind of continued support that Israel continues to have from countries like Germany and the United States? I think you're muted, Stefan.
Apologies. If you look for rationale behind it, political rationale behind it, it's pretty hard, because it's basically a pin and needle strategy, basically exposing Hezbollah's disorganized structure, Hezbollah's unableness to respond accordingly and to be actually protective towards its own people. Both Iran and Hezbollah leadership are now basically to be blamed for the kind of weakness they're shown and the kind of unattentiveness versus those various strategies Israel is applying. We just actually get news that those heavy bombardments, which we see today, was also targeting one of the major leaders of Hezbollah again in Beirut, Ibrahim Akhil. And Ibrahim Akhil is one of those who is masterminding all the bombings in Israel. So that's the second high Hezbollah leader, which is pinpointedly targeted in Beirut. It shows the superiority of Israel. But that can't be the goal, as you rightly say. So it's a political idea. I guess there is at least sort of a plan. And one plan is that right now, until November 5 at least, Israel has free hands. It can basically wage war as it pleases. And since it has the military superiority, it uses this window of opportunity, not knowing what might happen after the elections. In terms of political progress, it's simply to diminish and to prove that Hezbollah and to prove that the organization is weak and not capable. Let's see whether the next days do bring the feared retaliatory escalation from the Hezbollah side. I don't see it. I don't think they're military capable, at least not at a scale which we do have to fear Israel to suffer from it. And even if they scale it up, there will be the American pledge to stand at Israel's side and to help fending off another major wave of air attacks from Hezbollah missiles.
Yeah, just to, if I can jump in and just follow.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Yeah, just to follow on what Stefan said, I think that the political rationales are really important, not just looking at what Israel wants to achieve vis-a-vis Hezbollah, but also looking at its relationship with the US and also looking at internal politics in the country as well. You know, if you spoke to analysts about the potential for a war in Lebanon a couple of months ago, I mean, pretty much most people would say that neither side really wants to have a war at this point. Neither the Israelis don't really have the capacity or the capability to fight in Gaza and in Lebanon at the same time, and also that Hezbollah would also be quite overmatched, and that they would kind of be maybe not seeking to really escalate at the same time. But the issue is that the kind of dynamic that they're in could push them forward, you know, closer and closer to a bigger conflict, even without either side really ready for a full-on conflict. But what's happened since then is that we've really seen, you know, the nature of the operation in Gaza has wound down a little bit. But at the same time, Benjamin Netanyahu is still in the same political situation in his own country as well. You know, one of the common analyses of the conflict there is that, to a certain degree, the war diverts attention from his own issues, both political opposition and also corruption trials in the country. The question is to what degree he really kind of needs the conflict to continue in order to maintain, you know, his political position in the country. Secondly, is vis-a-vis the US, the Israelis could say, you know, in for a penny, in for a pound at this point. I was just on a briefing with the National Security Council spokesman, John Kirby. And one of the main questions to him was whether or not the US has pretty much lost its influence over the Israeli government and lost its ability to restrain the Israeli government. They might feel like, you know, this is their point, and this is the moment when they can, you know, basically execute and act on these things that they want to achieve. And as Stefan said, that this moment might last until the next election.
Stefanie, you're looking at the political situation in the United States as part of your day job. Having an escalation like this cannot be seen in the White House either by the Biden administration, but importantly also by the vice president, and as something that helps her campaign. And in some ways, it probably does. It doesn't hurt Donald Trump to see that the administration can't control Israel, and particularly since his argument is it wouldn't have never happened under him. Are there political ramifications of this that you think may go beyond just what's happening in the ground, that will actually have an impact on the elections here?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. The one thing, of course, is the consequences of what is going on in Israel on the chances of Kamala Harris to be elected. We know that very well, that there is this uncommitted voters in Michigan, pro-Palestinian students and so on. And actually, one representational group of them, I think Wednesday, announced that they were not going to support her. So that's another important group, as we know in the swing states. It will come down to tens of thousands or maybe 100,000 votes. But I think there's a sense here in Washington generally, because we were discussing about this the other day, thinking of October 7th, so the anniversary of the Hamas terror attacks. And there's a sense that the US leadership is gone, because there's too much going on. There is Middle East, there is Iran, there is now Lebanon. Of course, there is Ukraine, and there is China. And it feels a bit like, of course, it's now it's my first electoral campaign here. I only came here last year, but I don't know if this is due to election campaign. And obviously, the government doesn't want to commit too much because, as we said, it has repercussion here on the ground. But there is there is really a sense of an inflection point, as Joe Biden often says, that what and where is U.S. leadership in all this?
Stefan, interesting. Wasn't that long ago that the French president came to the United States and talked about the absence of American leadership. That was Chirac under Clinton. We've been through this over and over again, but there is this sense of helplessness that no one seems to be able to control the situation there, including the United States.
And we'll talk Ukraine in a minute, but exactly this is the point. Where's America's leverage? What is the U.S. actually able to change on the ground? You can either do it by threatening to use force or by threatening to credibly withdraw power or force support. And but the isolationist tendencies and the electorate being not really willing to support the world in its quarrels seem to pay off now. And I was struck actually this week that Donald Trump now went up against the Jewish vote, as he called it, and said if he wouldn't be elected, this would be also due to the Jewish vote, which had a clear anti-Semitic undertone in it. And I was struck because he's obviously, either way, not really expecting to gain from the situation. So he may very well turn totally against it and say, well, these people are betraying us. This is not our war. We're out there. So Israel really has the window of opportunity, or the window of, until the elections, to act. And this is what Netanyahu does.
Well, it's a fascinating, though extremely depressing set of issues. But the Middle East keeps on giving in one form or another for these kinds of discussions that we have, and hopefully the situation will not escalate even further for the good of Israel, but also for the good of the region and ultimately for everyone. Stefan, you raised the president's speech to a Jewish American meeting, and Stefanie, that sort of is a good transition to what's happening in European politics, in your own country, in Germany, where there's a major election, but also in U.S. politics, where it seems that the right is starting to gain quite significantly. And I was struck in my travels in Europe in the last few weeks how many people are looking at the possibility of Donald Trump's selection as sort of fast driving forward the far right movements in Europe, and the fear that has. So bring us up to date. Sort of where is the politics going? First of all, in Germany, but in other places as well.
Yeah, it's kind of timely, as you say. There is a big election. I mean, it makes me smile a bit because in other times it wouldn't be a big election. It's only Brandenburg, one of the 16 Länder, that is voting this Sunday. But in the sense, it's a big election because it's the third election in an East European land within 3 weeks. So on the 1st of September, there were elections in Thuringia and in Saxony. In Thuringia, the AfD, the right-wing anti-immigrant extremist party that in Thuringia has a leader, Björn Höcke, who's been twice convicted for using publicly Nazi slogans. They won by far, and in Saxony they came second, but just, I think, a point away from the CDU. And the current polls, Stefan, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the current polls see the AfD like 2 points ahead of the SPD in Brandenburg.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it is possible that the AfD will also win there. And I just want to give you a flavor. I saw that Björn Höcke, the guy I was talking about, the leader of the Thuringia AfD, he was last night campaigning in Brandenburg, and he was giving a speech. And I tried to translate, but just to get a flavor. He said, there was a country that was populated by a people populated by the German people. There was social security, there was trust, there were neighborhoodship, there was solidarity, there was security and good education. He talked about the GDR in this instance, but it gives you a flavor of how it's been talked about, in what kind of ultra-nationalist idea. And this plays, of course, into the issue of migration. And I have not been living in Germany for a long time, and I myself sometimes are almost shocked how much anger and discontent and how it's growing towards the issue of migration. And even, I admit, among my own friends and my family, if you look at the numbers, there was a week or two ago, the Zeit had a very interesting poll. And it said that 82% of Germans say that the government has to limit immigration, and 84% in the East. And also, if you look at numbers in the spring, for example, about how people perceived immigration or how much it should be limited, maybe it was in the 30s. It's now gone up to the 60s and 70s. And of course, these things contribute to that. Like we had several, I think 2 or 3 in the last weeks or month attacks. One allegedly a terrorist attack in Solingen where 3 people were stabbed to death. So there is a sense of insecurity, a big sense of discontent. Of course, it's also because of social benefits that get distributed equally, more or less. It's a very complex issue, of course, but people perceive that migrants who have never paid into the system get the same as people who have always been in Germany. So this is one of the things. And then, of course, we should talk about leadership and Olaf Scholz. This is important because it's going to be very interesting. On Sunday night, on the dot at 6:00, we will have the first poll. And Olaf Scholz will be here in New York, interestingly, because he's attending a summit at the United Nations General Assembly. I think there will be lots of reporters coming with him to New York who are not going to report on the General Assembly, but on German politics. It looks like, but again, Stefan will know this better than me, that Scholz, if he loses this election, has a very hard time to become the Kanzlerkandidat in the election for September 2025. Shall I go on with Europe, or shall we stick with Germany?
Well, let's stick with Germany for a minute, and then we'll weave in the rest of Europe and indeed the United States as well. So, Stefan, the issue of the AfD is of course a big one, but German politics seems to be basically now driven by this one issue of migration in some ways, and one party that stands to gain by it. And others are starting to lose out about it. How do you see the sort of the evolution of politics in the country? Of course, the German government also put in some very serious limitations on border crossings in the last week or so in order to try to address public sentiment.
Well, nobody can claim that he wouldn't have seen that coming. This is all in the making for a long time. The striking thing, however, is that it obviously needs to hurt. You need to feel pain until you do act politically. And the pain was inflicted, as Stefan rightly said, in Solingen at this knife attack, awful thing, and now with the elections. And the elections in East Germany were all expected that way. We all knew that the AfD would end up at a third of the polls, but now it's there. And now they're almost in 2 of those states at the brink of ungovernability. They are not able to form governments. And without them, it might be a tough time. Saxony might go back to the polls. So this is an extreme unstable situation for German politics, which is used to stability and predictability and coalition building and compromising and all of this. All of a sudden, it's not about politics anymore. It's not about issues. It's about belief and ideology. And this is new. I disagree with Stefanie on Scholz's fate. I think he's the chancellor. It's pretty tough to take it from him, especially since his party, the Social Democrats, will not really fear that badly in Brandenburg. They will come in second. They will most likely run the next government again. But however, it is sort of a shock news to the established parties, to the central parties, that things are changing. And we're seeing a pattern which we saw all over Europe, which we saw in the Netherlands, definitely, which is the most striking part, which we saw a bit in France, and definitely which was there on the plate during the European elections in June. Even that one was expected, because the European elections usually serve as a kind of a lightning rod for these right-wing and extremist views to be voiced. Is this turning Europe into an unstable place? I'm not quite sure. It's not either or. Europe is always about compromising, about finding the middle ground, and still this can work somehow. It's getting much more uncomfortable. The argument is getting more heated. It's getting more aggressive. and this tears the fabric of societies. And people are shying away. They want to have peace and quiet. They don't want to be accused. And the shouting match is pretty hot now. This is the uncomfortable part of it, and it indeed then immediately translates into political decisions. And refugee issues now are high on the list. The German government was under severe pressure from other European governments for a long time to tighten its rules, not to be that sort of welcoming, which Germany still is, even though the governance has been changed before, after the major migrational movement in 2015 with Angela Merkel. But it wasn't enough, obviously, and people are still coming. And even though the numbers have gone down this year, dramatically gone down, people do perceive as being unprotected. And this is why now there is a lot of talk on taking away incentives, taking away sort of the money being paid for refugees, speeding up the asylum processes, bringing them back. The typical, mostly helpless symptoms of asylum policies, which try to find answers to it, but in the end can't, because these people are coming. Europe is an open continent. The Middle East is right next door. Most of those coming are from Syria and Afghanistan. And the only countries which now tighten their borders, the northern African ones, Tunisia, Morocco, they're being paid for doing this. So this is all just pushing back the problem, but the problem will actually, in my opinion, not go away. It will actually become more and more serious, because the reasons for migrating, economy, climate, you name it, political instability, war, they are manifold and they are not getting less.
Andrew, that's a pretty bleak picture that Stefan, but I think a realistic one, paints in terms of the sort of one of the underlying forces. I mean, how the question is, how does the right respond to that? Closing borders is one thing, but then everybody needs those needs the labor that comes with it, because we're becoming, all of us in Europe and the United States and even in parts of Asia, older societies, and we need to have younger labor to be part of that. And so there is this challenge of how you manage this process at a time of deep political uncertainty as well.
Yeah, I think that, this is a worldwide trend that we're seeing everywhere in Europe and the United States as well. But I think that fundamentally, this is, above all, this is a kind of a fundamental belief of these politicians, and it's a vote-winning tactic and strategy that, is proving to be pretty successful. As Stefan said, the immigration is becoming, actually, I think we've all said it, but the immigration in particular and the kind of migrant crisis has become a kind of key campaign issue all across Europe, pretty much around the world as well. It really seems to have a lot of pull and sway with voters. And I don't think that there's a kind of deep thought about what is to follow after that in terms of how, societies are going to be able to maintain a labor base, tax base, having younger voters, having younger people in the country who can continue to kind of generate wealth and make sure that the economies, have perspectives going forward for 20 years, 30, 50 years, even further into the future. The thing that it seems to me is just that if you look even at the kind of US elections at the moment, with Kamala Harris having, she was handed kind of immigration as the vice president, and it was seen as kind of a poisoned chalice. This is the absolute most difficult kind of issue to deal with in the US, and she very much avoided going down to the border in many cases, during that period, and she's been criticized for that, and it was seen as kind of a major strength or a major, I guess, route of attack for Trump during the recent debates, was to focus in on her kind of background of immigration, the fact that immigration in the States is also one of the kind of leading campaign issues. And ultimately, what she had to do in order to get out of that argument was to kind of distract him, I would say, by bringing up, crowd sizes, distract him by getting him off his game a little bit, but basically trying to avoid that issue, because she knows that she could be vulnerable with voters on it. So it's definitely a worldwide trend. But I think that in terms of the kind of knock-on effects and the consequences of what closing borders means for countries across Europe or for the US, I don't think that it really is a thought-through process. I think it's more about just capturing this perceptible feeling of kind of anger amongst voters.
Stefanie, you were just down at the U.S.-Mexican border, in part to report what was going on there, and in part to understand how that issue is driving American politics. When you were reading the Bernd Höcke quote, that sounded pretty familiar to anybody who's been watching the U.S. Elections about the country used to be peaceful and wonderful, and now it's being overrun by people who eat cats and dogs and all of that sort of stuff. But tell us a little bit about what you saw at the border, and then what you think the political impact of that is.
I think, as Andrew just said, it's a lot about perception. Of people perceive that they are threatened, that there's too many migrants. I was struck back in January when we went to report on the caucus in Iowa, and I spoke to a lot of Republicans, and they were all talking about immigration. And in Iowa, you really don't see many migrants. It's a bit like the phenomena of East Germany, where most people talk about immigration in the areas where there is least immigration. But then it's not only perception. So I was actually on the border of Arizona with Mexico in the very west in San Luis. And I was talking to an ex-police who described that for a while. So if you look at the Biden administration, and if you look at the numbers, in the year 2023, there were almost 3 million illegal crossings. So again, also the border and the immigration issue is so complex. There are so many layers. You have to be very careful who's a refugee, who's a migrant, who's illegal. No one is actually illegal, but then can become illegal and so on. But this ex-policeman told me that before the Biden administration, just recently, I think in June, really cracked down on the border, there were sometimes hundreds who overrun the port of entries and then ran into this very small town of San Luis, Arizona, so that's on the US side, and entered people's houses because they were hiding from the police. So there was a real, people experienced the threat of migration. But then the evening of the TV debate, I actually watched it with a local branch of the Republican Party. And there was an older lady who was saying, "Oh, immigration, that's really a massive problem." And then she looked at me and said, "Although actually here, I don't see any of this because they only come over the border and then they leave." So it's a mixture of what people experience. Then, of course, it's also, so I was visiting the border with the son of a Mexican immigrant who was telling me that his family, they don't want more migration because they are still illegal and they do jobs, low-skilled jobs. And they fear new migration because these new migrants, these new arrivals will work for less money and will work more. So there is so many layers of this. But as in Germany, as in France, as in Hungary and everywhere else, it works as a political parole, as a political slogan. It very much works to gain votes in the election campaign.
Well, we'll see how it works out on Sunday and in Germany and in other countries as we move along. But it's again an issue that not only is there, but doesn't seem to have a very good answer. And politicians playing short-term politics, as we saw in the Middle East, are doing the same with this issue, and we're stuck with the consequences. An issue, perhaps good segue, Stefan, to Ukraine, where there is an attempt now to see if there is some way to address the issue in a more strategic and longer term effort. The war, of course, continues. There are continuing debates between the Ukrainians and the Americans and within the United States on how many weapons to give and how they can be used. But there's also this new attempt that President Zelensky has been talking about now for quite a while, of putting forward a peace framework that he's supposed to be bringing along to New York and Washington in the coming week as he comes to the UN General Assembly. So where from your perspective are we with regard to the war writ large, as opposed to what's happening on the ground?
Yeah, exciting moment indeed. This is like this is coming in the same window of political opportunities we were talking about with Israel. Zelensky is traveling to New York. Everyone waits for his speech. He's meeting the president. The entire momentum actually gained pace when the infamous Yalta meeting happened in Kiev recently, by the Pinchuk Foundation. Half of the world, the Western world, gathered there to commit its support for Ukraine. And then Zelensky all of a sudden came up and said, well, I'll have a new peace plan. The question is, what is in it? And will he actually be prepared to make a major move, or would it be the same ideas which the Ukrainians have turned around and around at various conferences and meetings? The last one was at the famous one in Switzerland at the Birkenstock meeting last summer I think it was July, which was not attended by the Russians, and where the final communique was not signed by many of the attendees from all over the world. Now this whole thing comes at a point where we do several moves which could lead us to make political conclusions. Let's take the debate on whether Ukraine should be allowed to use long-range missiles striking into Russia. This has been an idea which was also backed a lot by the British government, the new one. The British Prime Minister was in Washington advocating for it. The Americans withdrew. And now there are two schools to read for what happened. Either Russia, by really threatening retaliation and by blaming NATO to be directly involved in the war, would be a participant of this war. Either Russia deterred the United States from taking the more offensive side, or the threat to use them was meant at Russia not to use Iranian missiles, which it just acquired. But these are sort of political tit for tats, which overshadow the battlefield situation and which are setting the stage for what we all expect. Something will have to change after November 5. But here I come back to the original questions we were debating earlier. What actually should happen on November 5? Where's the leverage of this administration? Where is the political idea? What are we talking about? Politically, we are seeing a lot of preparation for this debate on a peace process. The Indian Prime Minister, for example, and the Indian government is heavily involved now to get its foot in. They were in Moscow, they were in Kiev, they were traveling in Europe. They're preparing the Chitta follow-up conference, which again brings in the Saudis as intermediators. But all of those attempts circle around the same three questions. One is territory. Will Ukraine be willing to give up territory? The second is, what kind of securities does Ukraine get from Russia for actually giving up territories? And will there be guarantees, i.e., will there be a NATO membership for Ukraine as a guarantee that its remaining territory will be safe? On the NATO issue, things have moved fast over the past weeks. The German government is more and more retreating from the idea to offer NATO membership. Even the American one is. Zelensky seems to travel now to the United States in the hope that he gets a last-minute pledge by President Biden for NATO membership or active support. And on the broader peace term, I just want to quote Jake Sullivan's speech from which he gave at the Yalta conference the last days, where he said any peace plan that attempts to essentially impose peace on the people of Ukraine, that runs across fundamental principles of sovereignty, territorial integrity, democracy, and freedom, is not sustainable. So I wonder how that can be squared. It can't, because you don't see any attempt by the Russians to chip into this political debate, to move, to offer to do something. To the contrary, Putin is more stable than ever. The Kursk invasion has brought the people around him. They rally around the flag. His economic and military supply seems to be okay. He has no incentive to bow in, and he thinks to be militarily on the offensive, in a positive situation. So I'm a bit clueless, actually, what we should expect politically. It will be an attempt by Zelensky, who is politically under pressure at home, to consolidate his base, He hopes to get some backing from the outgoing administration, but in the end, there will not be enough political weight, not enough leverage from the American side or the European side to get Ukraine out of that mess.
Andrew, you've been reporting on and from Ukraine for a long time. You've been watching this conflict evolve. You share sort of Stefan's basic analysis that the situation is, when it comes to ending the conflict, is not moving in the direction that it needs to move.
Yeah, I think I agree with Stefan's analysis, which I thought was excellent. The key right now, I think, from the Russian point of view, is that time is on the Russian side. If we look at the conflict going forward for the next 12 months or 24 months, the Russians know that the situation is going to become much more dire more quickly for the Ukrainians than for themselves. It doesn't mean that things are going exceptionally well in Russia, and we're starting to see some of the economic drag from sanctions, in particular in terms of refurbishing military vehicles. The Russians are going to run out of capability in a period that's expected to be 24 or 36 months. But if we talk about surviving the next year, we talk about surviving the next winter, with the Russians targeting the Ukrainian power grid. The Russians and Putin know that every day is much more difficult for the Ukrainians to deal with than for their own country, and they're in a relatively more stable position. Part of that is the amount of support that Ukraine can expect to receive from Europe and from the United States. The elections in the U.S. and the actual just general political instability in the U.S., which is not something we're accustomed to saying, but during the NATO summit, a lot of people were calling the U.S. the kind of unreliable ally, because there was this massive question of what's going to happen after the election. Could aid to Ukraine dry up entirely? It becomes very hard to make long-term planning at that point. So there's a lot of pressure on Ukraine, I think, to look at some kind of negotiation. It's just that, as Stefan said, the Russians don't seem very keen to negotiate at the moment, or to sit down or anything like that, anything other than a full capitulation. So it's not really clear, how that political settlement is going to come about. But the situation pretty stably is getting worse by the moment. The question is, could the U.S. come through with some kind of massive change in its policy toward Ukraine, not sort of drip providing various military aid, economic aid, et cetera, but really step up its support to make it clear that Ukraine is going to fight, that it's going to maybe have the ability to actually, attain a victory in this war. I mean, my sense from my conversations here is that we shouldn't expect a massive change in U.S. policy in that direction if either candidate wins in November. And so Zelensky is coming to UNGA next week, to the UN General Assembly. He has a victory plan with him, which is, his kind of plan for how Ukraine will win the war, but it's going to be a kind of negotiation at one point. And I guess the key there is that, this is a plan that, amongst other things, is a product of pressure that's been put on him by the US and by others to come out with an initial bid to say, this is what I'm willing to kind of take in a negotiation. And so this is an opening bid from the Ukrainian government. And I think that what he and Joe Biden are going to discuss is going to be very heavily of how many of these things are you willing to give up in a negotiation? How much are you willing to step back, basically, to get to a peace, if it comes to that?
Yeah, I think that all of that makes sense, and the unknown that we face with Middle East and other questions that we've had up to this point is what happens on November 5th. I mean, we know that Trump has promised that he would end this conflict in a day, even before inauguration. J.D. Vance gave an interview explaining what that would mean, which was basically to allow the Russians to keep the territory they currently have, to establish a demilitarized zone between the two sides, and not to allow Ukraine to have any security arrangements with the West, let alone membership of NATO. Which, in other words, exactly what Putin is trying to achieve. I don't see that as a viable option for Ukraine. And on the other hand, I think, as Stefan rightly says, There is not a lot of appetite in Washington and nor in Berlin for serious security commitments to Israel, to Ukraine, but let alone NATO membership. That is the one thing that Biden has not been willing to move on. I don't see that happening in the next 3 months before an election. It may be something that a Harris administration could move on. Who knows? Uncertain in that level. So I do wonder, in some sense, whether the coming together of these issues isn't just a little premature when there's so much uncertainty with what will happen or not happen in the United States on this issue. Andrew, did you want to jump in here?
Yeah, I think that one of the main things that comes off of that is that the uncertainty itself becomes, affects basically the long-term planning. This is a war that requires the creation of production lines that goes years into the future. Artillery, ammunition, et cetera, et cetera. The Russians have a lot of spare capacity. Europe doesn't have as much spare capacity to produce a lot of this. And so if you don't know whether or not, if so much depends kind of on an election this year in the US, and it gets factored into the political decisions that are going to be made, you end up at a situation where you have to kind of assume the worst. And I think that is what the Biden administration had been doing to a certain degree before the decision was made for him to drop out. I think that there were serious discussions about how to wrap this up or to get to some kind of a negotiation stage before a potential Trump administration. So the uncertainty itself kind of plays a role, even if a Harris administration comes in next, and we assume that she would carry on a lot of the policies of the Biden administration. There's the damage to a certain degree has still been done. So it's on the political side, I think that it's quite key that the West really shows that there is some kind of stomach for long-term security and aid commitments. But as Stefan said, that isn't something that's really been coming through so far.
I guess the only silver lining I see is, and it's not really a silver lining, but the Russians are losing massive numbers of people, and they're not recruiting. In fact, they're recruiting less than they are losing on the battlefield each day. According to British intelligence, they're still losing about 1,100 men a day. That won't last till through the winter, but that's when you're losing 30 to 40,000 people a day, a month, it becomes hard to sustain a war, even if you have much more than the Ukrainians have. Again, we'll take another look at this in another edition, because we certainly want to know what President Zelensky will bring forward. Maybe he surprises us all. In the meantime, I want to thank all of you. Stefanie Bolzen had to step out early, but we're very grateful for her insights. Stefanie Bolzen of Die Welt, Stefan Kornelius of the Süddeutsche Zeitung, and Andrew Roth of The Guardian. And thank you all for tuning in this edition of World Review with Ivo Daalder. We'll be back next week with another edition. Until then, have a wonderful weekend.